If you are tired right now, this message is for you. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that sits behind your eyes, the kind that makes prayer feel heavy and worship feel distant. You still believe, you still love God, but something inside you feels drained and you are starting to wonder if He feels far because you are weak. Let me confront that thought directly. What if your exhaustion is not pushing God away? What if it is exposing the way you were taught to approach Him? Somewhere along the way, many of us learned that connection with God requires strength, focus, discipline, energy. We were taught that powerful faith looks intense, passionate, unstoppable. So when we feel depleted, we assume we are failing spiritually. But look carefully at the life of Jesus. In John chapter 4, He sits by a well, physically tired from the journey, not preaching, not performing miracles, just sitting. And that is where a divine encounter happens. What if connection is not about climbing upward, but about collapsing honestly? Stay with me, because what you are about to hear may change the way you approach God forever. When your soul is tired of being strong, there is a specific kind of fatigue that no one sees, the exhaustion of always being the responsible one, the stable one, the one who keeps believing for everyone else. You smile in church, you give advice, you show up. But internally you feel like you have been holding your breath for months. The soul gets tired when it has to perform resilience. The problem is not weakness, the problem is pretending you do not have any. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, Paul writes that divine power reaches its fullness in human weakness, not in hidden weakness, in acknowledged weakness. The soul cannot connect deeply while it is busy protecting its image. If you are tired of being strong, maybe this is the first honest moment you have had in a long time. And honesty is not a threat to God. It is an invitation. But there is a subtle lie that may still be whispering inside you, and if we do not expose it, it will keep you distant. The lie that God only meets the energetic. There is a silent belief that shapes the way many people approach God. It says that He responds faster to those who are spiritually vibrant, emotionally intense, constantly motivated. It suggests that divine presence is drawn to energy, so when you feel drained, you assume you are disqualified. But trace that idea back to Scripture and it collapses. In Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, Jesus does not call the energized, He calls the weary. He does not say, "Come to me when you are disciplined." He says, "Come to me when you are burdened." The lie says God meets you at your peak. The gospel reveals He meets you at your breaking point. This distortion often begins subtly. You have a season of spiritual fire. You feel focused, consistent, expressive. Then life presses in. Work increases. Responsibilities multiply. Emotional weight builds. Your energy drops. And instead of adjusting your rhythm, you assume something is wrong with your faith. But God is not attracted to adrenaline. He is drawn to authenticity. Think about Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19. After calling down fire from heaven, he collapses under a tree and asks to die, exhausted, afraid, emotionally empty. And what does God do? He does not rebuke him for lack of passion. He lets him sleep. He feeds him. He restores him quietly. If God only met the energetic, Elijah would have been abandoned under that tree. The danger of this lie is subtle. It makes you perform vitality instead of seeking presence. It turns spiritual life into emotional production. And here is the uncomfortable question you may not have asked yourself yet. Are you trying to impress God with energy you no longer have? Because if you are carrying something He never asked you to carry. There is something deeper beneath this lie, something rooted in how we understand our limits. The theology of human limits. You were not created to be limitless. That may sound obvious, but most of us live as if exhaustion is a personal defect instead of a structural reality. We treat limits like flaws to overcome rather than boundaries designed by God. Look at the life of Jesus carefully. In John chapter 4, He is tired from the journey. In Mark chapter 4, verse 38, He is asleep in the boat during a storm. In Luke chapter 5, verse 16, He withdraws to solitary places. The Son of God embraced fatigue, hunger, solitude, and the need for rest. If limitation was sin, Jesus would not have experienced it. Your body has limits, your emotions have limits, your attention has limits, even your spiritual focus has limits. And yet we secretly believe that mature faith eliminates these boundaries. It does not. Mature faith learns to respect them. Genesis reveals that even in a world untouched by sin, God established rhythm, work and rest, activity and pause, creation and Sabbath. Limits were built into perfection. Exhaustion is often not rebellion. It is the consequence of ignoring design. When you try to pray beyond your emotional capacity, serve beyond your mental stability, or carry beyond your spiritual weight, you are not being holy. You are bypassing your humanity. And here is what changes everything. God relates to you through the humanity He created, not the superhuman version you are trying to become. What if your tiredness is not a spiritual failure, but a signal that you have crossed a boundary your soul was never meant to cross alone? Before we talk about how to reconnect, we need to understand something else. Sometimes, what feels like distance from God is not distance at all. Why spiritual disconnection often feels like emotional numbness. Sometimes you say, I feel far from God, but what you actually feel is nothing. No tears during worship, no strong emotions in prayer, no sense of warmth when reading scripture, just neutrality, flatness, silence inside. And because you were taught that connection must feel intense, you interpret numbness as absence. But emotional numbness is often not spiritual distance, it is psychological protection. When the mind is overloaded for too long, when stress remains unresolved, when expectations are constantly high, the nervous system does something intelligent. It reduces sensation. It lowers emotional intensity so you can survive. The problem is that when emotions dull, your perception of God can dull with them. In Psalm chapter 42, the writer speaks to his own soul, asking why it is cast down. Notice that he does not accuse God of leaving. He recognizes that his inner world is heavy. Numbness does not mean God withdrew. It may mean you have been carrying too much for too long. Here is the dangerous leap many people make. They assume that if they cannot feel God, He must not be near. But Scripture never equates presence with sensation. Connection is not always emotional. Sometimes it is covenantal. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is simply choosing to remain. If you keep chasing emotional intensity as proof of closeness, you will miss the deeper forms of intimacy that grow in stillness. And that leads to a tension we must confront next. Our culture trains us to move fast, but your soul was not designed for speed, the sacredness of slowness. You are not tired only because you work too much. You are tired because you never slow down internally. Your body may sit. Your mind never stops. Notifications, expectations, comparisons, responsibilities, even your spiritual life becomes another task to complete. Read, pray, improve, grow, repeat. Speed has become normal. Urgency feels productive. Slowness feels irresponsible. But Scripture reveals a different rhythm. In Luke chapter 10, verse 39, Mary sits at the feet of Jesus while Martha moves with urgency. Martha is not immoral. She is overwhelmed, and Jesus does not correct her service. He corrects her anxiety. Slowness is not laziness. It is alignment. When you rush into prayer, rush through Scripture, rush out of silence, you carry the noise of the world into the presence of God. Then you wonder why you cannot sense depth. Your soul needs transition. It needs space to settle. The sacredness of slowness is this: it allows your inner world to catch up with your outer life. Connection with God is rarely found in haste. It grows in attentiveness. If you never decelerate, you will mistake divine quietness for divine absence. But there is something even more honest we need to address. Sometimes it is not speed that blocks you. Sometimes prayer itself feels heavy. When prayer feels heavy, instead of holy, there are days when the idea of praying feels exhausting before you even begin. You know the words, you know the structure, you know what you are supposed to say. But the thought of organizing your feelings into spiritual language feels like lifting weight you do not have strength to carry. So you delay. Then you feel guilty. Then the distance feels greater. But ask yourself honestly, when did prayer become performance? In Matthew chapter 26, verse 38 to 39, Jesus enters Gethsemane overwhelmed with sorrow. He does not deliver a polished declaration. He speaks plainly. He asks if the cup can pass. He expresses distress. Prayer in its purest form is not impressive. It is honest. The heaviness often comes from trying to sound faithful when you actually feel fragile. You do not need theological precision when you are tired. You need sincerity. God does not require a speech. He welcomes presence. Sometimes the most powerful prayer is a sentence. Sometimes it is silence with awareness. Sometimes it is simply saying, "I am here, and I do not have much to offer today." If prayer feels heavy, maybe you are carrying expectations that were never placed on you by God. And if we keep peeling this back, we will see that Jesus himself modeled something we rarely talk about. He practiced intentional pauses. Jesus and the ministry of pauses. We often study the miracles, the sermons, the confrontations. We highlight movement. We celebrate impact. But we overlook something subtle in the life of Jesus. He paused. In Mark chapter 1, verse 35, before the crowds could gather, he withdrew to a solitary place to pray. In Luke chapter 5, verse 15 to 16, when his popularity increased, he did not accelerate. He retreated. When demands multiplied, he reduced exposure. He practiced distance from noise. Pauses were not interruptions in his mission. They were protection for it. You assume that if you slow down, you will lose momentum. Jesus shows the opposite. Pauses preserved clarity. They guarded identity. They sustained intimacy with the Father. Your exhaustion may not come from serving. It may come from never stepping away. There is a difference between dedication and constant availability. If the Son of God needed separation from crowds to remain aligned, why do you believe you can remain spiritually grounded while constantly connected to everything and everyone? The ministry of pauses is the courage to step back without fear of being forgotten. But even when you pause, there are moments when heaven feels quiet, and that silence can be unsettling if you misunderstand it. The difference between spiritual silence and divine absence. There are seasons when you pray and nothing shifts. You read and nothing stirs. You wait and nothing changes. Silence stretches longer than you expected, and your mind begins to interpret it as distance. But silence is not the same as absence. In Job chapter 23, verse 8 to 10, Job says he looks for God forward and backward and does not perceive him. Yet in the same breath he declares that God knows the way he takes. Notice the tension. Lack of perception does not equal lack of presence. Silence tests trust more than noise ever could. We are conditioned to equate response with relationship. If someone stops answering messages, we assume withdrawal. But God is not bound to constant sensory affirmation. Spiritual silence often matures you in ways emotional intensity cannot. It shifts your faith from reaction to conviction. Divine absence would mean abandonment. Silence often means formation. The danger is not the quiet. The danger is the interpretation of the quiet. If you assume God left, you pull back. If you understand he may be shaping something deeper, you remain. And sometimes what feels like silence is not about God at all. It may be about the subtle ways we try to carry everything alone. The ego hidden inside self-sufficiency. You may not call it pride. You call it responsibility. You tell yourself you are just being strong, just being dependable, just handling what needs to be handled. But beneath that strength, there can be a quiet resistance to needing anyone, even God. Self-sufficiency feels noble. It feels mature. It feels controlled. But it quietly blocks intimacy. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8 to 9, Paul admits that he was burdened beyond his strength, so that he despaired of life itself. Then he says something revealing. This happened so that they would not rely on themselves, but on God. Pressure exposed dependence. When you insist on carrying everything internally, you leave little room for surrender. You pray, but you have already decided how you will fix it. You ask for help, but you remain in control. Exhaustion often comes from sustaining an image of capability. The ego does not always boast loudly. Sometimes it whispers, "I have to manage this alone." But connection requires vulnerability. God does not compete with your strength. He fills the space your strength releases. If you are tired, it may not be because you are weak. It may be because you have been trying to be invincible, and when strength finally collapses, something unexpected can happen. That collapse can become surrender. Exhaustion as a form of surrender. There comes a point when you cannot push any further, not because you lack discipline, not because you stopped caring, but because something inside you has reached its limit, and in that moment, you face a decision. Resist the weakness or accept it. Most of us resist. We try to regain control, we promise to try harder, we reorganize our schedules, we intensify effort. But exhaustion has a purpose. It exposes the illusion that everything depends on you. In Psalm chapter 127, verse 1-2, it says that unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain, and that he gives sleep to his beloved. Sleep is not just biological rest, it is symbolic trust. Exhaustion can become surrender when you stop fighting your limits and start entrusting your life to God within them. Surrender is not dramatic, it is quiet. It sounds like this: I cannot sustain this on my own anymore. When you reach that point, you are closer to authentic connection than when you were performing strength, because surrender removes negotiation. And once you stop trying to prove yourself useful to God, you are ready to rediscover something deeper. You are ready to relearn how to be with Him instead of constantly doing for Him. Relearning how to be with God instead of doing for God. Somewhere along the way, your relationship with God may have shifted from communion to contribution. You measure your spiritual life by output, how much you served, how much you produced, how consistent you were, and without realizing it, being with God became secondary to doing things for Him. But activity is not intimacy. In Revelation chapter 2, verse 2-4, Jesus speaks to a church that worked hard, endured patiently, and did not grow weary in effort. Yet He says they had left their first love. They were committed, but disconnected. It is possible to be busy in God's name and distant from His heart. Being with God requires presence without agenda, no task, no performance, no need to impress, just awareness. When you are exhausted, doing feels safer than being, because being exposes how little energy you have. It forces honesty. But connection grows in stillness, not in output. You do not strengthen intimacy by increasing activity. You strengthen it by increasing attentiveness. If your spiritual life has become another responsibility, you will feel tired even in worship. And there is one more barrier we must confront. Even when you slow down and choose presence, something inside can still remain loud. The inner noise that blocks divine awareness. You can be physically still and internally chaotic. You sit down to pray, but your mind replays conversations. You try to focus, but unfinished tasks resurface. You attempt silence, but comparison, fear, and self-criticism grow louder. The issue is not that God is distant. The issue is that your inner world is crowded. In 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11-12, Elijah experiences wind, earthquake, and fire, but the Lord is not in those forces. Then comes a gentle whisper. The divine voice was present, but it was not competing with noise. Your mind has been trained for stimulation. Constant input, constant reaction, constant evaluation. When you approach God with that same mental speed, subtle awareness becomes difficult. Inner noise is not sin. It is accumulation, unprocessed stress, unresolved pressure, unspoken emotion. If you do not create space to quiet the noise, you will assume God is silent when your thoughts are simply too loud. Connection requires margin inside. And to create that margin, you must dare to do something uncomfortable. You must show up without filters, without rehearsed lines, without pretending stability. The courage to show up unfiltered. Most people do not struggle to approach God. They struggle to approach Him honestly. You have learned how to pray the right words. You know how to sound grateful. You know how to express faith. But beneath those words, there are emotions you edit out. Frustration, doubt, disappointment, fatigue. You filter yourself before you speak. Yet look at David in Psalm chapter 13. He asks, "How long will you forget me?" That is not polished devotion. That is raw exposure. And it is recorded as scripture. Unfiltered presence is not disrespect. It is relational depth. When you hide parts of yourself in prayer, you reduce intimacy. Real connection requires risk, the risk of being seen without strength. God is not threatened by your honesty. He already sees it. What changes the relationship is when you allow yourself to be seen by Him consciously. Exhaustion often strips away pretense. It removes your ability to perform spiritual enthusiasm. And that is not loss, that is opportunity, because when filters drop, authenticity rises. And when authenticity rises, you begin to discover something unexpected. God is not waiting in extraordinary moments. He is present in the ordinary ones you usually overlook. Meeting God in the ordinary, not the extraordinary. You may be waiting for a powerful moment, a surge of emotion, a dramatic answer, a spiritual breakthrough that feels unmistakable. But most of your life is not dramatic. It is ordinary, routine, work, dishes, commutes, conversations, fatigue at the end of the day. If you believe God only moves in the extraordinary, you will miss Him in the places where you actually live. In Luke chapter 24, verse 15 to 16, two disciples walk on the road to Emmaus discussing disappointment. Jesus draws near and walks with them, yet they do not recognize Him. The resurrected Christ was present in a normal conversation on a dusty road. Connection does not always announce itself. God often reveals Himself inside daily rhythm, not outside of it. When you are exhausted, you do not need a mountaintop experience. You need awareness in the middle of your routine. The sacred can exist in washing your face at night, in breathing deeply before answering someone, in whispering gratitude while driving. You do not have to escape your life to encounter God. You encounter Him inside it. And this changes everything, because if He is present in your weakness, in your slowness, in your ordinary moments, then the distance you feared may have never existed. You don't climb to God. He comes to you. You have spent so much energy trying to rise, trying to improve, trying to stabilize, trying to regain passion, trying to feel again, trying to become strong enough to deserve closeness. But the foundation of the gospel was never about you climbing upward. In John chapter 1, verse 14, it says, "The Word became flesh and dwelled among us." God did not wait at a distance for humanity to reach Him. He stepped into weakness, into limitation, into ordinary human life. Connection begins with descent, not ascent. When you are tired, you do not need to elevate yourself spiritually. You need to remember that God already moved toward you. In Romans chapter 5, verse 8, it declares that while we were still weak, Christ died for us. Not after we recovered, not after we proved consistency, while weak. This means your exhaustion is not a barrier. It is a place where grace is already active. You do not climb into His presence through strength. You receive His presence through trust. Right now, in your fatigue, in your limited energy, in your quiet struggle, He is not asking you to perform. He is inviting you to rest in what He has already done. You are not distant. You are seen. And sometimes the deepest connection happens when you stop trying to reach heaven and realize heaven already reached you.